You think you know Elizabeth Fries, England's Virgin Queen, the brilliant monarch who defeated the Spanish Armada and ushered in the Golden Age. But what if I told you that this legendary ruler was so filthy, so grotesquely unwashed, that foreign ambassadors would literally gag when entering her presence? What if the woman who claimed divine purity was actually a walking, talking health hazard whose stench could be detected 3 rooms away? The truth about Elizabeth's personal hygiene is so revolting that court historians spent centuries covering it up. We're talking about a queen whose body had become such a breeding ground for disease and rot that her own servants would burn bundles of herbs just to make the air breathable during royal audiences. Elizabeth's hygiene obsession wasn't about cleanliness, it was about avoiding it entirely. She held the bizarre belief that bathing would wash away her carefully constructed facade and reveal the horrifying truth underneath. Palace records show that she took fewer than 6 baths during her entire 45-year reign. 6 baths in nearly half a century. To put this in perspective, even medieval peasants bathed more frequently than the Queen of England. But here's where it gets truly disturbing. Elizabeth's refusal to wash wasn't just a personal quirk, it was a calculated strategy to maintain her image of divine perfection. She had convinced herself that water would somehow diminish her royal essence, that cleanliness was beneath her station as God's chosen ruler. The palace staff developed an elaborate system of coping mechanisms. Servants would secretly place sachets of lavender and rosemary throughout the royal apartments, not for decoration, but as desperate attempts to mask the overwhelming odor that followed the queen everywhere she went. They created special long-handled brushes and tools to dress her from as far away as possible, because getting close to Elizabeth's unwashed body was considered a form of punishment duty. Foreign diplomats wrote coded letters back to their home countries, describing the English court's unique aromatic challenges. One French ambassador diplomatically noted that Her Majesty possesses a most distinctive and memorable presence that announces itself well before her arrival. Translation: You could smell Elizabeth coming from down the hallway. The most shocking part: Elizabeth was proud of her filth. She wore her refusal to bathe like a badge of honor, claiming that frequent washing was a sign of moral weakness and vanity. She told courtiers that truly pure people didn't need to cleanse themselves because their inner virtue prevented external contamination. This was a woman who had turned basic hygiene into a philosophical and religious statement. But her servants knew better. They understood that Elizabeth's divine purity was actually creating a toxic environment that was slowly poisoning everyone around her. The Queen's unwashed state had become so extreme that palace physicians began documenting unusual illness patterns among staff members who worked in close proximity to her. Yet even as her body began to revolt against decades of neglect, Elizabeth doubled down on her anti-bathing philosophy. She claimed that her refusal to wash was proof of her superiority over other monarchs who weakened themselves with regular cleansing. The woman who ruled one of the most powerful empires in history had convinced herself that basic hygiene was beneath her royal dignity. The truth was about to become far more horrifying than anyone could have imagined. Elizabeth's bathroom habits were just the beginning of her personal hygiene nightmare. What she did to compensate for never bathing was so toxic, so potentially lethal, that modern forensic experts believe she was essentially poisoning herself to death, one cosmetic application at a time. Since Elizabeth refused to wash, she had to find other ways to maintain her carefully crafted appearance. Her solution was to slather her unwashed skin with layers upon layers of makeup so thick that it essentially created a painted shell over her rotting flesh. We're not talking about a light dusting of powder here. Elizabeth's daily makeup routine involved applying inch-thick coats of cosmetics that would have made a circus clown jealous. The foundation of this grotesque beauty regimen was a substance called Venetian ceruse, a mixture of white lead and vinegar that gave her the porcelain pale complexion that became her signature look. But here's what Elizabeth didn't know, or chose to ignore. White lead is incredibly toxic. She was literally painting her face with poison every single day, and because she never washed it off completely, the lead was being absorbed directly into her bloodstream. The application process was a horror show in itself. Palace servants would use brushes and spatulas to spread the toxic paste across Elizabeth's unwashed face, trying not to breathe too deeply as they worked around skin that was often covered in open sores and rashes. The makeup would crack and flake throughout the day, falling off in chunks that revealed glimpses of the diseased flesh underneath. But the white lead foundation was just the beginning. Elizabeth would then apply thick rouge made from cinnabar, which contains mercury, another deadly poison. Her lips were painted with a red dye containing sulfur compounds that would literally burn the skin with prolonged contact. She was essentially creating a chemical cocktail of toxins that was slowly eating away at her face while she slept. The most disturbing part was how this makeup routine had become a prison. Elizabeth couldn't risk washing her face completely because it would reveal the full extent of the damage underneath. The lead-based cosmetics had caused chronic skin conditions, open wounds, and discoloration that made her natural appearance truly horrifying. So she had to keep applying more and more makeup to cover the problems caused by the makeup itself. Palace physicians later described Elizabeth's skin as corrupted and full of holes, with permanent scarring from the toxic cosmetics she refused to stop using. The makeup had eaten away at her flesh like acid, creating craters and lesions that never healed because they were constantly being repoisoned with fresh applications of lead and mercury. Her morning makeup routine took over 3 hours and required multiple servants working in shifts because the fumes from the cosmetics were so toxic that prolonged exposure would make them violently ill. Workers would literally take turns applying Elizabeth's makeup to avoid being overwhelmed by the chemical vapors rising from her unwashed, toxin-soaked skin. The Queen's vanity mirror told a story of progressive deterioration. What had started as an attempt to enhance her natural beauty had evolved into a desperate attempt to hide the damage caused by her own beauty routine. Each day required more makeup to cover the problems caused by the previous day's makeup, creating an endless cycle of toxicity that was slowly killing her. But Elizabeth had become so addicted to her poisonous beauty routine that she couldn't stop, even as the evidence of its damage became impossible to ignore. She was trapped by her own vanity, forced to continue poisoning herself to maintain the illusion of the perfect, untouchable virgin queen. The worst was yet to come. By the 1580s, Elizabeth's hygiene had deteriorated so completely that her own palace staff had developed what amounted to a secret survival protocol. We're talking about servants who would literally draw straws to determine who had to help dress the queen, because getting within arm's reach of her unwashed, chemical-soaked body had become a genuinely dangerous assignment. The palace chambermaid rotation system tells the whole story. What should have been an honor, serving the Queen of England personally, had become a punishment duty that servants would try to avoid at all costs. New maids would often quit within days of their first close encounter with Elizabeth's toxic personal hygiene situation. Those who stayed developed their own underground support network, sharing remedies for the nausea, headaches, and skin irritation that came from prolonged exposure to their monarch's chemically corrupted presence. Palace records show that the staff began implementing increasingly desperate measures to cope with Elizabeth's condition. They installed primitive ventilation systems in her private chambers, basically just networks of hidden fans and air channels designed to move the toxic fumes away from areas where people had to work. The Queen's dressing room was equipped with what amounted to medieval hazmat protocols, with servants using long-handled tools and working in quick shifts to minimize their exposure time. But here's where the situation gets truly bizarre. Elizabeth's ladies-in-waiting developed an elaborate code system to warn each other about the Queen's particularly bad days. They would use specific flower arrangements and jewelry choices to signal when Elizabeth's hygiene situation was especially toxic, allowing other court members to adjust their schedules accordingly. A certain combination of roses meant avoid close contact, while specific pearl arrangements warned that the Queen's makeup was cracking more than usual, releasing extra chemical vapors. The most disturbing aspect was how this conspiracy of silence extended to foreign dignitaries. English protocol officers would brief visiting ambassadors on court customs that were actually survival instructions. They would recommend specific seating arrangements that maximized distance from the Queen, suggest particular perfumes that could mask the smell, and even provide coded explanations for why audiences with Elizabeth were kept unusually brief. French diplomatic records from this period contain veiled references to the particular challenges of English court etiquette. One ambassador wrote to his king that Her Majesty maintains customs that require significant preparation and endurance from visitors. Spanish diplomatic correspondence includes requests for special aromatic preparations before English court visits, with one ambassador specifically asking for the strongest perfumes available as if preparing for a siege. The palace physicians were trapped in an impossible situation. They could see that Elizabeth's hygiene practices were literally killing her, but suggesting that the Queen of England needed to bathe was tantamount to treason. Instead, they developed elaborate fictional explanations for her declining health, blaming everything from bad air to astrological influences, while carefully avoiding any mention of the obvious cause. Dr. Lopez, Elizabeth's personal physician, kept coded medical records that read like horror stories. He documented chronic eruptions of the facial region, persistent aromatic discharge, and progressive deterioration of the oral cavity. All medical euphemisms for the fact that his patient was rotting from the outside in due to her refusal to practice basic hygiene. The servants who worked closest to Elizabeth began showing symptoms that modern doctors would recognize as chronic chemical poisoning. Palace records document an unusual number of respiratory problems, skin conditions, and nervous system disorders among the Queen's personal staff. They were literally being slowly poisoned by prolonged exposure to the toxic chemicals Elizabeth smeared on her unwashed body every day. But perhaps the most tragic aspect was how Elizabeth's condition affected her relationships with the people closest to her. Even her most trusted advisors began finding excuses to conduct business through written correspondence rather than face-to-face meetings. The woman who ruled an empire was becoming increasingly isolated, not by political intrigue, but by her own toxic personal hygiene. The conspiracy of silence was about to crack under the weight of an even more horrifying reality. By the 1590s, Elizabeth's toxic beauty routine had created a medical catastrophe that palace physicians could no longer ignore or explain away. The Queen's mouth had become such a disaster zone of rot and decay that foreign ambassadors would later write home describing their shock at witnessing what they diplomatically called the monarch's unique dental presentation. Elizabeth's teeth had begun falling out in chunks during court sessions. Palace records document instances where the Queen would be in the middle of delivering a royal proclamation when pieces of rotted tooth would literally crumble out of her mouth and fall onto the floor. Servants developed a protocol for quickly sweeping up dental debris during royal audiences, trying to maintain some dignity while their monarch's mouth gradually collapsed. The smell emanating from Elizabeth's rotting teeth was so overwhelming that it created its own microclimate of horror. People standing within 10 feet of the Queen would begin experiencing involuntary gag reflexes. Her speech became increasingly difficult to understand, not just because of the missing teeth, but because the constant pain and infection in her mouth made it nearly impossible for her to form words properly. Dr. Lopez's medical records from this period read like a dental horror novel. He documented complete destruction of the upper molars, advanced putrefaction of the gum tissue, and persistent discharge of corrupted matter from the oral cavity. In plain English, Elizabeth's mouth was literally rotting while she was still alive, and the infection was spreading throughout her entire head. But here's where the situation becomes almost incomprehensibly tragic. Elizabeth's vanity prevented her from seeking proper dental care because any treatment would have required removing her toxic makeup, revealing the full extent of the damage to her face. She chose to endure the agony of rotting teeth rather than risk exposing her chemical-scarred skin to palace physicians. The Queen's diet had to be completely restructured around her dental situation. Solid food became impossible to chew, so palace cooks were forced to prepare everything in liquid or paste form. Elizabeth's meals consisted of broths, gruels, and pureed substances that could be consumed without requiring functional teeth. Even this limited diet caused her constant pain as the acidic foods came into contact with her infected gums and exposed nerve endings. Foreign diplomats began reporting that Elizabeth was nearly impossible to understand during formal audiences. Her missing teeth combined with the chronic pain and swelling in her mouth, turned every royal pronouncement into a slurred, wet mumble that required translation by courtiers who had learned to decipher her deteriorating speech patterns. The most horrifying aspect was how the dental rot was affecting Elizabeth's mental state. The constant pain, combined with the ongoing chemical poisoning from her makeup, was creating noticeable changes in her personality and decision-making abilities. Palace records document increasingly erratic behavior, violent mood swings, and periods of apparent confusion that corresponded directly with the worsening of her oral health crisis. Elizabeth's attempts to hide her dental situation became increasingly desperate and bizarre. She would stuff her mouth with cloth padding before public appearances, trying to create the illusion that she still had a full set of teeth. This practice made her speech even more incomprehensible and created additional health risks as the cloth became soaked with the infectious discharge from her rotting gums. The Queen's morning routine now included having servants clean blood and pus from her mouth, a process so nauseating that even experienced palace medical staff would become violently ill. The smell of Elizabeth's breath became so toxic that her food tasters began refusing to work, claiming that the residual odor from the Queen's utensils made them unable to detect whether food had been poisoned. But perhaps most tragically, Elizabeth's dental crisis was about to trigger a cascade of health problems that would transform her from a merely unhygienic monarch into something approaching a living corpse. The infection in her mouth was spreading deeper into her system, and the chemical poisoning from her makeup was accelerating the process. The woman who had once been called the most powerful ruler in Europe was about to discover that power meant nothing when your own body became your worst enemy. By 1600, Elizabeth's hygiene catastrophe had reached such horrific proportions that her own Privy Council began implementing what amounted to damage control protocols for interacting with their increasingly toxic monarch. The woman who had once held court for hours, charming foreign ambassadors and commanding the attention of Europe's most powerful men, was now so revolting that even her closest advisors were finding excuses to avoid her presence. The isolation began subtly. Council meetings that once lasted hours were suddenly shortened to 30-minute sessions, with advisors claiming urgent business elsewhere. Robert Cecil, her most trusted minister, began conducting the majority of government business through written correspondence, citing efficiency, while actually trying to minimize his exposure to Elizabeth's overwhelming stench and the toxic fumes emanating from her chemically corrupted body. Palace physicians documented an alarming pattern. Anyone who spent extended periods in close proximity to Elizabeth was developing respiratory problems, chronic headaches, and skin irritations. The Queen's ladies-in-waiting were showing symptoms of what modern doctors would recognize as chemical poisoning: nausea, dizziness, and neurological problems caused by prolonged exposure to the lead and mercury vapors rising from her unwashed, makeup-caked skin. But here's where Elizabeth's condition created a truly nightmarish political situation. Foreign ambassadors were beginning to refuse audience requests, not out of diplomatic protocol, but because spending time in the same room as the Queen of England had become a legitimate health hazard. The Spanish ambassador wrote to Philip III describing Elizabeth as a figure of such corrupted presence that audiences must be concluded swiftly to preserve one's constitution. The most tragic aspect was how Elizabeth's isolation fed into her growing paranoia and mental instability. The chemical poisoning from decades of lead-based makeup was affecting her brain function, causing memory problems, violent mood swings, and episodes of apparent confusion. Combined with the chronic pain from her rotting teeth and infected skin, Elizabeth was becoming increasingly unpredictable and difficult to manage. Palace staff developed an elaborate early warning system to track the Queen's movements through the castle. Servants would place sachets of herbs along corridors where Elizabeth was expected to walk, not as decoration, but as desperate attempts to create breathable air pockets for anyone who might encounter her unexpectedly. The smell of her approach had become so distinctive that people could literally track her location by following the odor. Elizabeth's food tasters quit en masse during this period, not because they feared poisoning, but because they could no longer tolerate the toxic residue left on utensils after the Queen had used them. The smell and chemical contamination from her mouth had made it impossible for them to perform their duties. Palace cooks began preparing her meals with special implements that were immediately discarded after use, treating the Queen's dining requirements like a hazmat operation. The most disturbing development was how Elizabeth's condition was affecting her grip on reality. Palace records document instances where she would hold conversations with empty rooms, apparently unaware that her advisors had fled due to the overwhelming smell. She began issuing royal proclamations to audiences that had gradually evacuated, leaving her talking to herself while toxic fumes rose from her disintegrating body. Dr. Lopez, her longtime physician, finally broke professional protocol and began documenting the full extent of Elizabeth's condition. His private notes describe a monarch whose physical corruption has reached such extremes that normal medical intervention may no longer be possible. He noted that Elizabeth's skin had developed permanent discoloration from the toxic makeup. Her breath was so foul that it caused immediate nausea in anyone nearby, and her mental state was deteriorating rapidly. The Queen's mirror had become her greatest enemy. What she saw reflected back was so horrifying that she began refusing to look at herself directly, instead relying on painted portraits that bore no resemblance to her actual appearance. The gap between her self-image as the glorious Virgin Queen and the toxic, rotting reality of her physical condition had created a complete psychological break with reality. By 1602, Elizabeth was essentially ruling England in complete isolation, surrounded by people who could barely tolerate being in the same building, let alone the same room. The woman who had once commanded the attention and respect of the civilized world had become so physically repulsive that her own government was conducting business around her, rather than with her. The end was coming, and it would be more grotesque than anyone could have imagined. When Elizabeth I finally died on March 24, 1603, at age 69, the scene was so horrific that several witnesses required medical attention. The woman who had spent 45 years refusing to bathe, slowly poisoning herself with toxic makeup, and allowing her body to rot from the inside out, had become something that barely qualified as human by the time death finally claimed her. Dr. Lopez, who had served as her physician for over 2 decades, later wrote that approaching Elizabeth's deathbed was an ordeal that tested the limits of medical duty. The smell emanating from her dying body was so overwhelming that windows had to be opened throughout Richmond Palace, and servants burned enormous quantities of herbs and incense just to make the air breathable for those attending her final moments. But the true horror was revealed when palace officials attempted to prepare Elizabeth's body for burial. What they discovered would haunt everyone involved for the rest of their lives. When they finally removed the thick layers of toxic makeup that had been accumulating on her skin for decades, they found flesh so corrupted and diseased that embalmers initially refused to work on the corpse. Elizabeth's face, once hidden beneath inch-thick coats of lead-based ceruse, was revealed to be a landscape of chemical burns, permanent scarring, and open wounds that had never healed. The toxic makeup had literally eaten away at her skin like acid over the decades, creating craters and lesions that had been constantly reinfected by fresh applications of poisonous cosmetics. Her natural skin color was no longer visible beneath the permanent chemical staining. Her mouth presented an even more horrifying sight. When embalmers opened Elizabeth's jaw, they found virtually no remaining teeth, just infected stumps and rotting gum tissue that had been concealed by her elaborate speaking protocols. The infection had spread so extensively through her oral cavity that it had begun affecting the bone structure of her skull. But the most shocking discovery came when physicians examined Elizabeth's internal organs. Her lungs were blackened and damaged, likely from decades of inhaling the toxic fumes from her own makeup. Her liver showed severe signs of heavy metal poisoning from the lead and mercury she had been absorbing through her skin. Most disturbing of all, her brain tissue appeared to have been affected by chronic chemical exposure, which explained the paranoia, memory problems, and erratic behavior of her final years. The embalmer's records, initially suppressed by royal order, eventually leaked to European courts and created a scandal that lasted for decades. Foreign ambassadors, who had endured audiences with Elizabeth, suddenly understood why the experience had been so traumatic. They hadn't been meeting with a queen. They had been in the presence of a walking corpse who had been slowly decomposing for years while still technically alive. Palace servants who had worked closest to Elizabeth during her final years were found to have developed serious health problems from prolonged exposure to her toxic presence. Several died within months of her death from what modern doctors would recognize as complications from heavy metal poisoning. The woman's hygiene habits hadn't just killed her, they had been slowly killing everyone around her. The most bitter irony was how Elizabeth's obsession with maintaining her image of divine perfection had transformed her into something genuinely monstrous. The Virgin Queen, who had claimed that bathing was beneath her royal dignity, had spent the last decades of her life as a toxic, rotting creature whose own body had become her greatest enemy. When news of the autopsy findings spread through European courts, Elizabeth's reputation underwent a complete transformation. The monarch, who had been feared and respected across the continent, became a cautionary tale about vanity, pride, and the horrific consequences of believing yourself above the basic requirements of human hygiene. Perhaps most tragically, Elizabeth's death revealed the ultimate futility of her lifelong battle against cleanliness. All those decades of refusing to bathe, all that toxic makeup, all the chemical poisoning and physical corruption, none of it had preserved her beauty or extended her life. Instead, it had transformed one of history's most powerful rulers into a rotting, toxic nightmare whose own body became a horror show that traumatized everyone who witnessed it. The Virgin Queen's true legacy wasn't political or cultural, it was medical. Elizabeth VI had proven that power, wealth, and royal status meant nothing when measured against the basic biological requirements of human health. She had lived and died as living proof that even queens are not exempt from the consequences of ignoring the most fundamental aspects of personal hygiene. Her putrid corpse served as a final, grotesque reminder that beneath all the ceremony, power, and divine right, even the most exalted rulers are nothing more than flesh and blood, flesh that rots and blood that poisons when basic human care is abandoned in favor of vanity and pride.